Connection rarely fails because people are unavailable. It fails because it is pursued from instability. At first, pursuit feels natural. You reach out, you adjust, you explain, you invest. There's effort, but it feels justified. Connection seems to require work. Over time, however, something shifts. The more connection is chased, the less secure it feels. The more energy is invested, the less return it seems to bring. This pattern is common, and it is rarely recognized for what it is. Most people assume the problem lies in others. They are distant. They are avoidant. They are inconsistent. Sometimes this is true, but very often the issue is internal. Carl Jung observed that relationships are not formed merely through compatibility, but through compensation. When something is unstable or lacking internally, the psyche seeks balance externally. Chasing connection is often an attempt to compensate, not consciously, structurally. The individual may not feel insecure. They may feel capable, thoughtful, and emotionally aware. Yet the pursuit continues. They try to be understood. They try to be chosen. They try to maintain closeness through effort. This effort is subtle. It does not always look desperate. It may appear as flexibility, as patience, as emotional availability. But underneath, there is a negotiation taking place. Worth is being adjusted in real time. The individual may notice that they tolerate more than they want to. They explain themselves when no explanation is required. They adapt to dynamics that feel slightly misaligned. None of this feels dramatic. It feels relational. Yet the psyche is tracking something important. Self-respect is being traded for connection, not deliberately, incrementally. This trade rarely produces stability. In fact, it produces the opposite. The more self-respect fluctuates, the more connection becomes unstable. Research in relationship psychology consistently shows that relationships formed under conditions of unequal self-regard tend to exhibit higher levels of anxiety, inconsistency, and power imbalance. The imbalance is not always visible, but it shapes behavior. One person adjusts more. One person waits more. One person explains more. Chasing becomes normal. The problem is not effort. The problem is where effort is coming from. Effort rooted in wholeness feels different from effort rooted in compensation. Compensatory effort is restless. It seeks reassurance. It reacts quickly. Wholeness-based effort is selective. It responds rather than pursues. Carl Jung emphasized that what is unconscious in us seeks expression through others. When self-relationship is unstable, relationships become the arena where that instability plays out. This is why chasing connection feels urgent. Urgency signals imbalance. When connection feels essential to inner stability, the psyche cannot wait. It cannot risk distance. It cannot tolerate ambiguity. So it reaches. This reaching often appears as overavailability. You reply quickly. You stay longer than you want to. You smooth over discomfort. Not because you are weak, but because something inside you is negotiating safety. This negotiation has a cost. Boundaries soften. Preferences blur. Standards become flexible. Flexibility is often praised. But flexibility without self-respect creates erosion. Over time, the individual may notice a familiar pattern. They attract people who are uncertain, emotionally inconsistent, or unable to meet them fully. This pattern is not punishment. It is correspondence. Carl Jung described this as a psyche meeting itself in external form. What is unresolved internally tends to repeat relationally until it stabilizes. Chasing connection keeps the pattern alive, because the chase reinforces a belief that connection must be earned. Earned connection always feels precarious. It depends on performance, on availability, on accommodation. This creates anxiety. Even when things are going well, the individual may feel uneasy. They monitor tone. They watch for shifts. They prepare for withdrawal. Connection becomes something to manage. This management is exhausting. Studies on attachment dynamics show that individuals who chronically monitor relational security experience higher cognitive load and emotional fatigue. Even in otherwise stable relationships, the mind is always on guard. This vigilance is not love. It is regulation. Love does not require constant adjustment. It requires presence. Presence cannot exist when self-respect is unstable. This is why chasing eventually fails. Not because effort is wrong, but because effort replaces alignment. The psyche notices when alignment is missing. It begins to withdraw satisfaction. The individual may feel connected but unfulfilled, involved but unsettled. Something always feels slightly off. This offness is important. It is a signal that connection is being used to stabilize something internally rather than to share something already stable. Carl Jung warned that relationships formed to fill an inner gap often collapse under the weight of that demand. No person can carry what the psyche must resolve. Eventually, patterns repeat. People drift away. Dynamics stall. Connections end quietly or painfully. The individual may feel confused. They did everything right. They were understanding. They were patient. Yet the outcome is the same. The psyche is not responding to effort. It is responding to structure. Until the inner relationship stabilizes, outer relationships cannot. This does not mean isolation is required. It does not mean withdrawal is necessary. It means chasing cannot succeed. Chasing assumes lack. Alignment assumes sufficiency. When sufficiency is absent, connection becomes a pursuit. When sufficiency stabilizes, connection becomes a response. This distinction changes everything. But before it changes, the psyche often allows chasing to exhaust itself, not as punishment, as completion. The individual reaches a point where effort no longer feels viable, not because they give up, because the cost becomes clear. They begin to sense that connection should not require self-abandonment. This sensing is the beginning of self-respect stabilizing. Nothing has changed externally yet, but internally, something has been recognized. Connection pursued at the expense of self-coherence cannot last. That realization does not end loneliness. It does not guarantee alignment, but it ends the chase. And the end of the chase is the necessary condition for something different to emerge. Not better people, but a different relational foundation. One where connection no longer requires negotiation of worth. That shift has not happened yet, but the pattern that prevented it has become visible. And once visible, it can no longer operate unnoticed. That is where this phase begins. When chasing connection ends, nothing immediately replaces it. There's often a quiet gap. The individual may feel less driven to pursue closeness, but not yet settled in themselves. The old pattern has loosened, but the new orientation has not fully stabilized. This gap is essential. It is where the relationship with the self becomes visible. Carl Jung emphasized that the most decisive relationship a person has is not with others, but with their own inner position. When this relationship is inconsistent, outer relationships absorb the tension. When it stabilizes, outer dynamics reorganize without instruction. Self-respect does not arrive as a declaration. It arrives as consistency. Consistency in how you treat your own boundaries. Consistency in what you tolerate. Consistency in what you no longer negotiate. Earlier, boundaries may have existed conceptually. You knew what you wanted. You knew what felt wrong. But knowledge did not always translate into action. Action was interrupted by fear of loss, fear of disconnection, fear of being misunderstood. So boundaries bent, not dramatically, incrementally. This bending is where self-respect erodes. Self-respect is not self-esteem. It is not confidence. It is not affirmation. It is behavioral alignment. When your actions consistently contradict your internal limits, the psyche registers instability. That instability seeks compensation through others. This is why relationships become charged. The other person becomes responsible for restoring balance, for choosing you, for staying, for confirming worth. This burden destabilizes connection. Research in relational systems consistently shows that when one person relies on a relationship to regulate their self-concept, the relationship becomes asymmetrical. One adapts more. One waits more. One explains more. The imbalance is structural, not moral. When self-respect stabilizes, the structure collapses. Stabilization does not require confrontation. It does not require cutting people off. It does not require withdrawal. It requires internal consistency. You begin to notice small changes. You pause before responding. You notice when something feels misaligned. You stop explaining discomfort away. These are not dramatic acts. They are micro-adjustments. But micro-adjustments compound. Carl Jung described this process as a withdrawal of projection. When you stop projecting unmet inner needs onto others, those others are freed from carrying them. This freedom alters a relationship automatically. In daily life, this may show up as fewer emotional negotiations. You do not preemptively reassure. You do not overcontextualize your needs. You state what is relevant and allow space. The space is new. Earlier, space felt dangerous. Silence felt like distance. Distance felt like loss. Now, space feels neutral. This neutrality signals self-containment. Attachment research supports this observation. When individuals develop internal regulation, they tolerate relational ambiguity more easily. The need to secure closeness through behavior decreases. The result is paradoxical. As you stop chasing, connection becomes more available, not because others change intentionally, but because the dynamic has changed. People respond differently to those who are not negotiating their worth. They feel less pressure, less expectation, less obligation. This does not reduce intimacy. It deepens it. Intimacy requires choice. Choice disappears when connection is compulsory. Carl Jung emphasized that genuine relationship can only occur between two differentiated individuals. When one person is still using a relationship to complete themselves, differentiation is incomplete. Self-respect completes differentiation. This completion does not feel empowering. It feels settling. You no longer need to prove availability. You no longer need to perform understanding. You no longer need to stay longer than feels right. This is not withdrawal. It is congruence. Congruence is often mistaken for rigidity, but rigidity enforces rules. Congruence follows alignment. You may still compromise, but compromise no longer costs you. This distinction matters. In relationships, compromise that costs self-respect creates resentment. Compromise that aligns with values does not. As self-respect stabilizes, resentment fades, not because issues resolve, because misalignment decreases. Studies in long-term relationship satisfaction show that resentment is more strongly correlated with self-betrayal than with conflict frequency. Conflict can exist without erosion. Self-betrayal cannot. The psyche tracks this accurately. When self-betrayal stops, emotional charge reduces. You may notice that you are less reactive, less vigilant, less invested in outcomes. This does not mean you care less. You care differently. Care is no longer mixed with fear. Fear once drove attachment. Now, attachment stands on its own. Carl Jung described this as a shift from dependent relatedness to conscious relationship. In dependent relatedness, the relationship stabilizes the self. In conscious relationship, the self stabilizes the relationship. This inversion changes everything. You may notice that certain people fall away, not through conflict, not through confrontation. They simply drift. This drift is not loss. It is incompatibility becoming visible. Earlier, effort masked incompatibility. Now, without effort, misalignment reveals itself. This is often experienced as relief. Quiet relief. No one is blamed. Nothing dramatic happens. The relationship no longer fits. Fit becomes a guiding principle. Fit does not need justification. You do not argue yourself into staying. You do not argue yourself into leaving. You sense, and you respond. This sensing grows more reliable as self-respect stabilizes. Because self-respect clarifies what belongs and what does not. In daily life, this may show up as fewer ambiguous connections, fewer situationships, fewer unresolved dynamics, not because you demand clarity, because you stop participating in ambiguity that undermines you. Ambiguity loses its appeal. It no longer promises validation. Validation is no longer required. Carl Jung warned that when unconscious needs drive relationships, repetition is inevitable. When those needs integrate, repetition ends. Patterns dissolve, not because you changed others, because you stop repeating yourself. This is where the phrase, "the right people appear," becomes misunderstood. People do not appear magically. What changes is who remains. Those who rely on your accommodation may withdraw. Those who rely on imbalance may lose interest. Those who can meet you without negotiation stay. This filtering is automatic. It does not require discernment. It follows structure. Structure has changed. The relationship with yourself is now consistent. Consistency creates boundaries without enforcement, standards without explanation, availability without desperation. This is a psychological condition that allows healthier relationships to form, not because you learn how to relate, because you stopped abandoning yourself in order to relate. That shift completes something fundamental. Outer relationships now reflect inner alignment, not perfectly, not permanently, but reliably. And that reliability is what makes connection feel different, calmer, clearer, less effortful. This phase does not feel exciting. It feels stable. And stability is what allows relationships to deepen without collapsing. That stability has now formed, quietly, without announcement. And from that foundation, something different becomes possible. When self-respect stabilizes, relationships stop requiring vigilance. You no longer monitor tone. You no longer scan for shifts. You no longer rehearse what to say or when to say it. Not because relationships become effortless, but because they stop being compensatory. Earlier, connection carried an internal task. It was asked to regulate worth, to confirm value, to stabilize identity. Now that task is gone. Carl Jung described this moment as the psyche no longer outsourcing unresolved inner material to the external world. When the inner relationship becomes consistent, outer relationships are freed from carrying psychological weight they were never meant to hold. What replaces chasing is not distance. It is selectivity. Selectivity is often misunderstood. It is mistaken for withdrawal, for coldness, for detachment. But selectivity is simply responsiveness without self-betrayal. You still connect. You still engage. You still open. But you do not overextend. This changes everything. In daily life, this shows up in small, concrete ways. You answer messages when you have capacity. You do not rush to reassure. You do not fill silence prematurely. These behaviors are not calculated. They are natural consequences of internal stability. Attachment research consistently shows that individuals with stable self-regulation exhibit slower response patterns without being perceived as distant. In fact, they are often perceived as more grounded and more trustworthy. The absence of urgency signals containment. Containment invites respect. Earlier, boundaries required explanation. You felt the need to justify why something did not work for you, why you needed space, why you could not accommodate more. Now, boundaries exist without commentary, not enforced, assumed. This does not provoke conflict as often as expected. In fact, studies in interpersonal dynamics show that clearly embodied boundaries tend to generate less resistance than verbally negotiated ones. Resistance increases when boundaries are framed as requests rather than facts. Self-respect turns boundaries into facts. Facts do not argue. Carl Jung emphasized that when the ego is aligned with the self, behavior becomes declarative rather than defensive. You are no longer trying to convince anyone of your position. You simply occupy it. This occupation is felt. Others adjust accordingly. Some people respond positively. They lean in. They meet you at your level. Others disengage, not because you rejected them, because the dynamic they relied on is no longer available. This sorting process is quiet. No confrontations, no ultimatums, just fit revealing itself. Fit becomes obvious when effort disappears. Earlier, effort masked incompatibility. You carried conversations. You maintained momentum. You smoothed over gaps. Now, without that effort, gaps show. This can feel sobering. You may realize that certain connections existed only because you were sustaining them. This realization is not painful in the way loss once was. It feels clarifying. Research on relational maintenance shows that when one party stops overfunctioning, relationships either rebalance or dissolve. Both outcomes indicate structural correction. Correction is not punishment. It is alignment. Carl Jung believed that relationships formed through compensation inevitably require maintenance through effort. Relationships formed through individuation sustain themselves more naturally. This is where the right people appear becomes experiential rather than conceptual. You are not attracting through intention. You are not manifesting. You are not optimizing. You are no longer distorting the field. Without distortion, correspondence improves. People who are capable of mutuality stay. People who require imbalance fade. This happens without evaluation. You do not analyze compatibility endlessly. You sense resonance or lack of it. This sensing is reliable because it is no longer clouded by fear of abandonment. Fear once drove tolerance. Now, tolerance has limits. Limits feel calm. You are no longer afraid of losing connection, because connection is no longer the source of stability. Stability comes from consistency with yourself. Carl Jung wrote that when a person is no longer at war internally, they stop entering relationships as negotiations. They enter as participants. Participation is different from pursuit. Participation allows reciprocity. Reciprocity feels different in the body. There is less tension, less anticipation, less emotional spike. Relationships feel steadier, not because they are perfect, but because they are not compensating for anything. In romantic contexts, this often results in slower beginnings, less intensity, more realism. Intensity once created bonding, but it also created instability. Now, bonding occurs through continuity. Studies in long-term relationship formation show that relationships that develop without early intensity but with consistent mutual engagement tend to be more durable. Intensity accelerates attachment. Stability sustains it. Self-respect favors stability. This may initially feel underwhelming. You may notice that connections feel quieter, less dramatic, less consuming, but they also feel safer. You do not lose yourself inside them. You remain intact. Remaining intact is a defining feature of this stage. You can be close without dissolving. You can care without overgiving. You can commit without abandoning yourself. This is not restraint. It is coherence. Carl Jung understood coherence as a foundation of genuine relatedness. Without coherence, relationships become mirrors of conflict. With coherence, they become spaces of exchange. Exchange requires two stable positions. You now occupy yours. This does not make you immune to disappointment, or loss, or misunderstanding, but it changes how those experiences land. They no longer fracture your sense of self. You grieve without collapsing. You adjust without self-blame. You disengage without resentment. This emotional proportionality is a clear sign that self-respect has stabilized. Psychological resilience studies consistently show that individuals with stable self-concepts recover faster from relational stress, not because they suppress emotion, but because emotion does not threaten identity. Identity is no longer at stake. This is why relationships stop feeling like tests. You are not being evaluated. You are not auditioning. You are present. Presence attracts differently, not loudly, not immediately, but reliably. People who can meet you there recognize it. People who cannot move on. This movement is natural. You do not need to curate your circle. Your internal alignment does that for you. The right people do not arrive all at once. They appear gradually, quietly, without announcement. Often, you notice them only in hindsight. What you do notice immediately is what no longer appears. Chaos, ambiguity, emotional imbalance. These patterns lose their grip, not because you fight them, because you are no longer available for them. Availability has changed. You are available for reciprocity, for respect, for presence. You are unavailable for negotiation of worth. That boundary does not need reinforcement. It holds itself. Carl Jung believed that when inner alignment is achieved, outer life reorganizes not through effort, but through exclusion. What does not belong simply cannot stay. This is what living from stable self-respect looks like. Not isolation, not perfection, but relationships that no longer require you to disappear in order to exist. You remain yourself. And from that position, connection finally becomes what was meant to be: mutual, grounded, sustainable, without chasing, without fear, without losing yourself to keep someone else. That is the final shift, not attracting the right people. Becoming someone who no longer has to abandon themselves to be with anyone at all. Nothing dramatic announced this shift. There was no declaration of self-love, no moment where you decided to value yourself more. What changed was consistency. You stopped negotiating your limits. You stopped explaining discomfort away. You stopped adjusting yourself to secure a connection. Carl Jung understood this as the psyche no longer compensating for inner division through relationships. When the inner relationship stabilizes, outer relationships reorganize without effort. People did not arrive because you improved. They remained because you stopped abandoning yourself. What no longer fit quietly fell away. What could meet you without imbalance stayed. This is not a reward. It is correspondence. Relationships now reflect how you relate to yourself. Not what you say, not what you promise, but what you consistently live. And when self-respect becomes stable, connection no longer needs to be chased. It becomes mutual. It becomes grounded. It becomes real, without force, without fear, without losing yourself to keep anyone else.